I trust by now that you've already learnt about the two cerebral hemispheres, which contain the same number of neurons as stars in the Milky Way. We can compare these bilateral hemispheric structures to that of a planet. So if we had to zoom in on planet Earth, we would then find a series of continents. Similarly, for each of our cerebral hemispheres, we then find a series of cerebral lobes, and you'll remember that we have 4 cerebral lobes that we can see macroscopically. So just like each continent is made up of countries, each lobe then contains a comprehensive cytoarchitectural map of functional cortical areas. These are referred to as our areas of localization, or more traditionally, Brodmann's areas. I'm Dr. Nikki, an anatomist from Australia, and today we're going to use a drawing to learn approach to map out the approximate locations of our functional cortical areas. We will also discuss their functions as well as what happens with respect to clinical presentation should there be a lesion or damage to these areas. On the lateral view of the brain, I am going to label the important sulci or grooves that assist us with separating the cerebral lobes macroscopically. Firstly, we have the central sulcus, which is going to be continuous from the longitudinal fissure between the two hemispheres all the way down to the lateral fissure. Of the brain, we can see that either side of the central sulcus, we then have 2 vertical strips of gyri, which are called our pre-central gyrus and the post-central gyrus. And these are going to be of particular functional significance. Firstly, I want to start off with the 5 functional areas located in the frontal lobe. So you'll remember that this is the area of the cerebral cortex and the brain parenchyma that is going to be anterior to the central sulcus. You will also remember that the frontal lobe is predominantly involved in motor activities and output. Using the color green then, in the pre-central gyrus, specifically the most posterior strip of the frontal lobe, or immediately anterior to that central sulcus, we find the primary motor cortex. This cortex represents a topographically organized map of the skeletal muscles of the body, and it is responsible for our voluntary movements, that is, the initiation of movement, as well as fine motor movement. The specific functions for each of the functional cortical areas is provided in the box below as we move through this lightboard video, just for the purposes of space. So this map is actually arranged inversely, with the superior parts of the body found ventrally, so closest to that lateral fissure. This includes the tongue, the lips, and the face. As we then move superiorly, we then find the regions that are mapped to the hand as well as the upper extremity. We then have the trunk that is going to be most superior, and then located medially, we find the area that corresponds to the lower extremity. So you will note that on the lateral view, we don't actually see the cortex that corresponds to the lower limb. However, if we had to look at a medial view, we can see the area corresponding to our thigh, our lower leg, as well as the toes and the foot, for instance, are mapped at an area that's called the anterior paracentral lobule. Injury to the primary motor cortex will result in weakness or paralysis of the contralateral movements of the body. Anterior to the primary motor cortex, we then find the motor association area. And this is technically made up of 2 separate areas. So we have our premotor cortex and the supplementary motor cortex. So the premotor cortex is located on the posterior parts of the superior, middle, and inferior frontal gyrus. You'll remember that an association area is always located adjacent to a primary cortical area, and therefore is defined as a higher order integrative center, where it integrates and processes sensory input and motor output. So the premotor cortex then functions to store past data, and on the basis of our prior experiences, will then program or control our intended motor activities. This gyrus then extends to the medial side of the brain, where we then call it the supplementary motor area. And this is responsible for controlling movements in complex tasks that require us to retrieve motor memory, as well as integrate or use our temporal organization of sequential movements. Moving then anteriorly, within the middle frontal gyrus, we then find the frontal eye fields. This area is primarily responsible for the voluntary conjugate movements of the eyes, as occur when scanning the visual fields. Specifically, this area is going to contribute towards contralateral abduction of the eyes, as well as ipsilateral eye adduction. So damage to the frontal eye fields in one hemisphere will result in both eyes deviating towards the side of the lesion, as well as an inability to voluntarily move the eyes towards the contralateral side. Inferior to this region then, specifically on the left inferior frontal gyrus, we find a really important speech area that is called Broca's area. Broca's area is only found in the dominant hemisphere, which is going to be the left hemisphere in most of the population. It is going to communicate with another important speech area, referred to as Wernicke's area, that is located on the superior temporal gyrus or temporal lobe. Together, these two areas will allow us to engage in conversation, that is, actively listening, comprehending language, and then being able to respond accordingly by producing speech. So damage to Broca's area will cause Broca's or non-fluent aphasia, where an individual has difficulty planning and executing the movements required to produce speech. These individuals may also have difficulty in naming objects, and you will see that they are visibly frustrated. The final functional cortical area for us to cover in the frontal lobe is going to be located at the frontal pole, and we call this the prefrontal cortex. It is ultimately the seat of our intelligence. This area is responsible for the makeup of our personality. It also includes our behaviors, our impulses, and our emotional regulation. It also houses our executive functions, that is, our decision making and our planning. It plays a role in learning, in working memory, as well as selective attention and focus. So it is thought that individuals that have attention deficits, such as the case in ADHD, that it is primarily the prefrontal cortex that may be implicated. A lesion in the prefrontal cortex can also result in frontal lobe syndrome. This is characterized by changes in personality, problems with planning and judgment, impulsive or aggressive behavior. Let's now move on to the parietal lobe. And in the parietal lobe, we find four main functional cortical areas of importance. So firstly, located posterior to the central sulcus, we then find the primary somatosensory cortex. This is the area of the cortex that will first receive the incoming sensory information, specifically from the thalamus and the associated ascending spinal pathways. More specifically, external stimuli. This is going to be information concerning temperature, pain, vibration, pressure, shape and size, as well as weight. Or internal stimuli, such as proprioception, is received by this cortex. This region also features a topographic arrangement similar to the primary motor cortex, where incoming information for specific body parts and regions can be isolated or mapped to specific areas of the somatosensory cortex. Behind this then, in the superior parietal lobule, we then find the association area. That is going to be the somatosensory association area. Incoming information from each of the body parts will then be passed on to the superior parietal lobule, which functions as the somatosensory association area. It is responsible for recognizing the object by shape, size, texture, and roughness. Ultimately, this association area will function to analyze and recognize sensation. This will also include tactile information of where the body is located in space. Below this then, we find the inferior parietal lobule, which encases the caudal end of that lateral fissure. Technically, it is comprised of two separate gyri. Firstly, we have the supramarginal gyrus that is located superior to the lateral fissure. As well as the angular gyrus that is going to be angled posterior and around, almost in an inverted C shape, to the lateral fissure. The specific function of the supramarginal gyrus is to process sensory modalities, which is our proprioceptive, auditory, visual, and somatosensory information, specifically concerned with phonological and articulatory processing of words. The angular gyrus, on the other hand, works on our semantic processing and the identification of colours. So lesions specifically in the angular gyrus on the dominant parietal lobe is going to cause Gerstmann's syndrome, where patients present with left to right confusion and inability to name their fingers and inability to count, as well as inability to write. So we can see that both of these strips of cortex are going to be responsible for the identification and characterization of objects. The inferior parietal lobule will then continue with the superior temporal gyrus, specifically Brodmann area 22, which in the dominant hemisphere forms Wernicke's area. So combined with the three pink dots, we can see that these three regions will contribute to the sensory speech area that is concerned with learning processes of reading, writing, and computing. The representation of this area also varies depending on the textbook that you'll be using. It is responsible for processing and understanding both written and spoken language. It allows us to understand and form a sentence and say it back in a comprehensive manner. Therefore, a lesion to this area results in Wernicke's aphasia, also referred to as fluent aphasia. We can see that speech is well articulated in these individuals, and they may even talk faster than usual, but their comprehension and repetition of written or spoken language is impaired. Because they aren't able to find the right words, speech appears meaningless and their words are often jumbled and incomprehensible. Alexia, which is an inability to read, and agravia, which is an inability to write, may also be associated with damage to Wernicke's area. So we've spoken about the left inferior parietal lobule. Let's think about the right. We know that this is our non-dominant area. So an injury to this particular region of cortex will result in hemispatial neglect syndrome. This is where spatial neglect or a lack of awareness on one side of the body, often the contralateral side, which would be the left in most individuals, is seen. For example, you may ask an individual to draw a clock face with numbers, and you'll find that they're only able to draw the right side. You will remember that the temporal lobe is responsible for our conscious awareness of sound. It is also responsible for the recognition of objects, faces, audio stimuli, and our emotions. There are 3 additional functional cortical areas of the temporal lobe that I'll explore with you today. So firstly, located on that superior temporal gyrus, right in the middle, we find the primary auditory cortex. And this is responsible for the conscious recognition or awareness of incoming sound. Surrounding this area, we then find the auditory association area, which functions or plays an important role in the perceptual and conceptual processing of that incoming acoustic sound. We can also then see highlighted in orange in the temporal lobe, but only viewed on the medial side, we then have the primary olfactory cortex, and this is responsible for that conscious awareness of smell. Since this region has connections with the amygdala, which is a structure within the limbic system, it helps us to tie our emotions to smell. For example, you can easily recognize your favorite perfume because it is quite pleasant. Body odor, on the other hand, is going to elicit the opposite response. Finally, anterior to the pre-occipital notch, we find Brodmann's area 37. This is the fusiform gyrus. It is going to extend across the basal surface of both the temporal and the occipital lobes, and it is involved in the higher processing of visual information for the identification and differentiation of objects, including color, faces, and words. On the dominant side, so on the left, the fusiform gyrus is going to function to recognize written words. These are required for reading, as well as within category identification. So that is types of flowers or subcategories of fruit. Finally, let's wrap up with the occipital lobe, which is our visual processing area. Located at the occipital pole, so right at the back of the brain parenchyma, we find the primary visual cortex. This is the first area of the brain to receive incoming sensory stimuli from the photoreceptors of the retina of the eye. On the medial view of the brain, we can see that this is organized around the calcarine sulcus or fissure, where visual information from the upper parts or portions of the retina will project above the calcarine fissure, and information coming in from the lower portions of the retina will then project below the calcarine sulcus. Finally, we can see, wrapping around the corpus callosum, we have the cingulate gyrus or cortex. This structure is technically part of the limbic system of the brain. However, it is incredibly fascinating because its function and its roles have for long been quite mysterious. We know now, though, that the cingulate gyrus plays a really important role or forms a connection hub between our emotions and our sensations. We also know that located in this strip of cortex, we find the areas responsible for our motivation as well as our imagination. It has been fun navigating the functional cortical area map of the cerebral cortex with you. Thank you so much for following on and supporting my YouTube channel, where I aim to break down complex concepts using an easy, simple drawing to learn approach.